The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Schobert. Chapter 1. Story of the Door. Mr. Utterson was a serious lawyer who almost never smiled. He was cold, embarrassed in his dialogues, backward in emotions, shy, and sometimes boring. Yet in some way he was adorable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something absolutely human lighted from his eye. Something indeed which was never found in his conversation, but found more often and loudly in the acts of his life. His lifestyle was simple, not with much luxury. He liked the theater, however he had not gone to watch any play for nearly 20 years. He had a tolerance for other people, and tended to assist them rather than accuse them. "I slope to Cain's opposite idea," he used to say strangely. "I let my brother go to the devil in his own way." In his character, it was often his chance to be the last reputable person and the last good impact in the lives of bad men. And to such as these, as long as they came about his rooms, he never exhibited a bit of change in his behaviors. Without a doubt, the task was easy to Mr. Utterson, as he was reserved under the best of conditions, and even his friendship seemed to be established in a similar broad-mindedness of friendly temperament. It is the indication of a humble man to accept his friendly circle ready-made from the hands of chance, and that was the lawyer's method. His friends were similar to him, or those whom he had known for a very long time. His fondness, like ivy, was the growth of time. They hinted no aptness in the object. Therefore, there was no doubt about the link that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant cousin, the famous man about town. It was a nut to crack for many people how these two people could find a common point, or how they got along so well. It was stated by the people who saw them in their Sunday walks that they spoke nothing, looked strangely boring, and would hail with clear relief the appearance of a friend. On one of these walks, somehow, their way led them down a by-street in a busy side of London. The street was not big and somewhat quiet, but it drove a great commerce on the weekdays. The residents were in good condition. It seemed in all in a competitively imitative manner, expecting to do better still, and laying out the surplus of their cereals, in order that the shop fronts stood along that highway with tempting people to buy. It was an invitation like lots of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it hid its charm and laid some more empty of passage, the street should shine again, contrary to the shabby neighborhood, like a fire in a forest, and with its recently painted shutters, shining materials, and general cleanliness and happiness of note, instantly received attention and pleased the eye of the passenger. There were two doors from one corner. On the left side, going east line was broken by the entry of a court. Just at that point, a certain evil block of building pushed its gable on the street. It was 2 floors high. It had no windows. There was nothing but a door on the lower floor and a blind side of a colorless wall above. It bore in every feature the marks of a long time untouched, old building. The door, which had neither bell nor knocker, looked very dusty. Some dirty children were playing fearlessly in this building, doing everything they wanted. Yet, it seemed that no one drove these random visitors away. A very interesting place. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by-street, but when they were passing the building, Enfield stopped, and pointing to the building, he asked, "Did you ever remember that door?" And his friend replied, "Yes, I remember. It's connected in my mind," added he, "with a very strange story." "Really?" asked Mr. Utterson, with a bit of change in the tone of his voice. "Won't you tell me?" "Well, let's go this way," returned Mr. Enfield. "I was coming home from some place at a very cold morning, about 3 o'clock, and my way led me through a part of town. There I could see nothing but lamps, street after street. All the people were asleep, street after street. All lighted up as if for a succession, and all as empty as a church. Suddenly I saw somebody, a little man who was walking along the street, and the other was a girl. She was maybe 8 or 10, and was running as hard as she was able to, down a cross street. Well, they ran into each other naturally enough at the corner, and then came the horrible part of the thing. The man walked over the little child's body while she was screaming on the ground. Actually, it was the worst thing to see. I can't forget that scene. It wasn't like a man, it was like a monster. I decided to run after the man rapidly. Then I caught him and brought him back to where there was already quite a group around the screaming child. He was unbelievably cool and made no resistance, but gave me one look. It was so ugly that it made me feel sick, interestingly. At last the girl's family arrived, and a doctor soon after them, for whom she had been sent, put in his appearance. "Well, the problem is, she was frightened more than hurt," said Dr. Sawbones. And there you would think this would be an end to it. But there was one unusual condition. I had looked with hatred to my gentleman at first sight. So the child's family had as me, which was simply natural. But the doctor's case was the one which was very interesting. He seemed as a kindly, quiet, ordinary doctor, of no particular age or color, with a strong Edinburgh accent. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Nothing different I saw. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Dr. Sawbones got mad and turned white with desire to kill him. I was able to predict what was in his mind, just as he knew what was in mine. Of course, we didn't kill him, but preferred the second best option. We told the man we could and would make his name notorious so that everyone in every part of London would know his name and hate him. If he had any, his credibility would certainly be lost, and his friendships too. I never saw an evil face like that, and there was the man in the middle with his coolness. He gave a black look, carrying off, and, sir, really like Satan. "Should you want to make money out of this accident," he said. "I am really helpless," said he. "Name your price." Well, then we agreed to £100 for the child's family. The next thing to do was to get the money that we agreed for. And where do you think he carried us but to that place with the door? He quickly took out a key, went in, and then came back with £10 in gold and a check for the rest of the amount. It was a check from Coote's Bank. It was drawn payable to bearer and signed with a name which I can't mention. However, it's one of the points of my story. But it was a name which is well known, really. The price was pretty high, but the thing to notice was the signature on it. Then I pointed out to the man that all the business seemed so doubtful to me, as a man does not normally walk into an empty house at 4 a.m. and come out with another man's check of £100. But he was quite calm, with an ugly look. "No need to worry," he said. "I will stay with you till the bank's open and cash the check myself." So we left, the doctor and the child's father and our friend and myself, and passed the rest of the night at my house. And next day, after we had breakfast, went to the bank. I gave in the check myself and said there was so much evidence that it was a forgery. No, interestingly enough, the check was genuine. "Well, well," said Mr. Utterson. "I think we feel the same," said Mr. Enfield. "Yes, it's a horrible story." That man must be one of those that nobody can have to do with. A really damned man. And the person who signed the check is very kind and gentle, also famous, and, what makes it worse, one of your fellows who do what they call good. Blackmail, I think, might be there, and there are other things to make us believe that this honest man could give a check to that damned man. You know, nothing can give an explanation to this strange situation, he added, with words that made us ponder. After these talks, he was recalled by Mr. Utterson, asking suddenly, "And you don't know if the person who signs the check lives there?" "A probable place, isn't it?" returned Mr. Enfield. "But I incidentally noticed his address. He lives in some square or other." "And have you ever asked about the place with the door?" Mr. Utterson asked. "No, sir. I had sensitivity," was the reply given. "Today it's an asking time for me. I feel this strongly. It takes an important place for the judgment. You start a question, and it's like dropping a stone. You sit quietly on the top of a hill, and the stone goes, moving others. I make this a rule of mine. The more it looks like a troubling place, the less I ask." The lawyer said it was a very good rule. "But I have studied the place for myself," continued Mr. Enfield. "It is very difficult to say that it is a house. There is no other door, and nobody goes in. There are 3 windows looking on the court on the first floor. There's not any below. The windows are always closed, yet they're clean. And then there is a chimney which is usually smoking, so I think somebody lives there. And however, I'm not so sure, as the buildings are so packed together about the court, that it's very difficult to define the beginning and ending parts of them." The two went on walking again for a while, quietly, and then Enfield called Mr. Utterson. "That's a good rule of yours." "Yes, I think it is," Enfield said. "But for all that," the lawyer went on, "there's one thing I must ask. I want to ask the name of that man who walked over to the child." "Well," said Mr. Enfield, "I don't see any bad points in answering this. His name was Hyde." "Oh," Mr. Utterson said, "can you give me some information about him?" "He is not easy to describe. I think there are some points with his appearance which make him seem annoying and hateful. I had never seen such a disliked man, and however I don't know exactly. He must have been deformed somewhere. When I look, he gives an impression of deformity, though I couldn't specify the point. He's a man of extraordinary looking. Sir, I can make nothing. I can't describe him, and it's not about memory. It's just something different." Mr. Utterson again walked some way in silence, and certainly thinking quite seriously. "Are you sure he used a key?" at last he asked. "My dear sir," began Enfield, in a surprised manner. "Yes, I know," said Utterson. "I know it seems so strange. If I do not ask you the name of the other side, you should understand it is due to the fact that I already know it. You see, Richard, your rumor has no reality now. If you have been inaccurate at any point, you should correct it." "I think you could have warned me," returned the other with an unhappy face, "but I have been strictly exact, as you call it." Mr. Utterson sighed, but never spoke, and the young man resumed. "Here is another lesson to say nothing," he said. "I'm ashamed of what I said. Let's agree to never refer to this again." "I accept, with all my heart," said the lawyer. "I shake hands on that, Richard." Chapter 2. Search for Mr. Hyde. That evening, Mr. Utterson came home to his bachelor house in a gloomy mood and sat down to dinner unhappily. On this night, contrary to what he usually did, as soon as he took his clothes off, with a candle, he went into his business room. He opened his safe, he took an envelope, Dr. Jekyll's will, and sat down to read its contents carefully. The will was written in the handwriting of the doctor. In case Henry Jekyll died, All his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde. Also in case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for more than 3 months. This document had long been irritating the lawyer. It offended him both as a lawyer and as a person who loves the reasonable and conventional sides of life, to whom the fanciful was the immodest. And until now it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde to swell his anger. Now, by a sudden change, he knew something. It was already bad enough when he only knew the name with which he could learn no more. It got worse when it began to be clothed upon with hateful characteristics, and out of the shifting, unreal mists that had so confused his mind, there a sudden appearance of a friend. "I thought it was madness," he said, while he was replacing the disgusting paper in the safe, "and now I begin to feel it is shameful." He blew out his candle, put on his coat, and went in the direction of Cavendish Square, where his friend, the great Dr. Lanyon, had his house. Lots of patients came to this house. If anyone knows, it will be Lanyon, he thought. The butler knew the lawyer, so welcomed him. He didn't encounter any delay, but was guided directly from the door to the dining room. Dr. Lanyon was drinking his wine. He was a hearty, healthy, lively, red-faced man, with prematurely white hair, and an excited and decided manner. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, he welcomed him with both hands. The warmth seemed so artificial at first, but it was a genuine feeling, for these two were old friends during their school years. After a while, the lawyer started to talk about his subject. "I suppose, Lanyon," he said, "you and I must be the two oldest friends of Henry Jekyll." "I wish the friends were younger," said Dr. Lanyon, laughing. "But I think we are. But I haven't seen him for ages." "Really?" asked Utterson. "I thought you had a bond of common interest." "We had," he replied. "But for more than 10 years, Henry Jekyll has been strange to me. He began to go wrong in mind, and although I went on to take an interest in him for old days' sake, he chose to stay the same." "Such unscientific ideas," added the doctor, "would have estranged Damon and Pythias." This situation relieved Mr. Utterson. They have only argued on some points in science, he thought. And as a man who doesn't have a big interest in science, he added, "It is nothing worse than that." He waited for a few seconds for his friend to recover his calm, and then decided to ask the question for the answer of which he had come to learn. "Have you ever seen a friend of him called Hyde?" he asked. "Hyde?" repeated Lanyon. "No, I have not even heard of him." Then suddenly saying goodbye, he went to his bed at home and couldn't sleep due to the thoughts that confused his mind. The bells of the church, which was near the house of Mr. Utterson, struck at 6 o'clock still. He was too busy to think about this problem. Until now, the problem affected him only intellectually. However, now his imagination was also fighting. Afterwards, Mr. Enfield's story passed in his mind as scroll of light pictures. He could easily be aware of the great field of lamps of a nocturnal city, a man walking quickly, a child running from the doctors, and then these met, and that so-called human stepped on the child and passed on without considering her screams. Alternatively, he would see a room in a rich house where his friend was sleeping, dreaming, and smiling at his dreams, and the door of the room would be opened, the curtains of the bed would be pulled, the sleeper recalled, and looked! A figure who was given power would there stand by his side, and even at that dead hour he must rise and command to himself. The figure in these two sides obsessively came to the mind of the lawyer. All night. In his dreams, he saw a man who had no face, who was walking over a girl. Even in his dreams, the man was faceless. If he could but once notice him, he thought the mystery would be revealed, and perhaps roll altogether away, as was the usual characteristic of mysterious things when well examined. He might think that his friend had a point in his strange preference, or see a reason for his friend's strange preference or bondage, and even for the surprising section of the will. At least it would be a face which was worth seeing, a face the owner of which had no feeling of mercy. Thereafter, Mr. Utterson began to visit the door in the by-street of shops frequently. In the morning, before office hours, at noon when business was abundant and time scarce, at night under the face of the city moon, which was covered with fog, by all lights and at all hours, the lawyer was present on his chosen post. If he is Mr. Hyde, he had a thought, I'll be Mr. Sleek. And at last his patience received the deserved reward. It was a lovely dry night, with frost in the air. By 10 o'clock, when the shops were closed, streets had no people, and they were very silent. Small sounds carried a long way. Domestic sounds out of the houses could easily be heard on either side of the roadway. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post when he heard an odd light footstep near, and in the course of his patrols at night he had got accustomed to the strange effect of footsteps of a single person. His attention had never before been so sharply and conclusively halted, and it was with a strong superstitious foresight of success that he departed to the entry of the court. The steps started to come nearer, and the volume increased suddenly when they turned the end of the street. The lawyer, looking forward from the entry, at last was able to see what sort of man he had to deal with. He was small, a simple-dressed man, and the appearance of him went in some way strongly against the watcher's inclination. But he went directly to the door, after crossing the roadway to save time, and when he came, he took a key from his pocket like a person approaching home. Mr. Utterson went next to him and touched him on the shoulder. "Are you Mr. Hyde?" Mr. Hyde stopped with an intake of the breath, but his fear lasted only 1 moment, and despite the fact that he did not look at the lawyer's face, he answered coolly enough, "Yes, I am. What do you want?" "I think you are going in," the lawyer said. "Dr. Jekyll is my old friend. I'm Mr. Utterson of Gaunt Street. I think you have heard of my name, and meeting you so conveniently, I thought you might accept me." "You cannot find Dr. Jekyll. He isn't home," replied Mr. Hyde. And suddenly, "How did you know me?" he asked. "On your side," said Mr. Utterson. "Can I ask something?" "With pleasure," he replied. "Will you please let me see your face?" the lawyer asked. Mr. Hyde seemed to hesitate, and then, somehow, let the lawyer see his face, standing under the street-light. "Now I'll know you again," said Mr. Utterson. "It can be useful." "Yes," Mr. Hyde said. "In case you need one day, here's my address." And he gave a number of a street in Soho. "Good God!" Mr. Utterson thought. "Has he been thinking about the will?" But he said nothing. "And now, how did you know me?" the other asked. "By description," was the reply given. "Who described?" "We have common friends," replied Mr. Utterson. "Common friends?" Mr. Hyde repeated the phrase, a little harshly. "Who are they?" "Jekyll, for example," said the lawyer. "He never told you!" shouted Mr. Hyde with anger. "I did not think you could lie to me." "Come on," said Mr. Utterson. "That is not proper language." The other growled angrily, and then turning his mood into a savage laugh right after that, with a very quick movement, he unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. The lawyer stood, staring at the closed door. Then he started to wander the street slowly, pausing and putting his hand to his forehead. Mr. Hyde was pale, felt some kind of sickness. He gave an impression of distortion without any nameable malformation. He had an annoying smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with some kind of a mixture of timidity and boldness, which seemed murderous, and he spoke with a husky, whispering voice, indeed a broken voice. All of this were the reasons for which he thought worse about him, but none of these together have been able to explain the unknown disgust until now, hate and fear with which Mr. Utterson looked at him. "There must be something else," said the gentleman whose mind was confused. "There is something more, if I could find a name for it. I can't name him human. Something semi-human, can we say? Or can it be the old story of Dr. Fell? Oh, my poor friend, Henry Jekyll, the only semi-Satan, semi-human creature that I have ever been able to see, is now your friend. He may take you into trouble." There was a square of old but good-looking houses. One of them was Dr. Jekyll's house. Mr. Utterson stopped and knocked. A well-dressed, aged servant opened the door. "Is Dr. Jekyll at home, Poole?" the lawyer asked. "I will see, Mr. Utterson," Poole said, and admitted the visitor. "Can you please wait here by the fire, sir? Or will I give you a light in the dining room?" "Here, thank you," the lawyer said. He got nearer and rested on the tall fender. Afterwards, he felt ashamed of his relief when Poole came and told him that Dr. Jekyll had gone out. "I saw Mr. Hyde go into his laboratory, Poole," he said. "Is that right? Is Dr. Jekyll away from home?" "Yes, that's right, Mr. Utterson," the servant replied. "Mr. Hyde has a key." "Dr. Jekyll seems to have a great trust in that young man, Poole," resumed the other thoughtfully. "Yes, sir, he really trusts," said Poole. "We have to obey his orders." "I do not think I ever met Mr. Hyde," said Utterson. "Oh, no, sir, as you said, he never dines here," Poole replied. "In fact, we rarely see him here. He generally comes and goes by the laboratory." "Okay, good night, Poole." "Good night, Mr. Utterson." And the lawyer started to walk home. He was very worried. Poor Harry Jekyll, he thought. He felt really sad. And the lawyer went on thinking deeply. Dr. Jekyll and thoughts about him did not leave his mind. He thought of a possible secret of the doctor's. Chapter 3. Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease. 2 weeks later, it was a very good chance that the doctor gave a dinner party for some of his special old friends, all of whom were intelligent, reputable men, and Mr. Utterson remained behind after the others had left. He was liked there and pleased. Then the lawyer started. "Is it possible to talk about a matter, about your will?" Someone who was watching them might find this conversation distasteful, but the doctor carried it off joyfully. "My poor Utterson," he said, "I have never seen a man who was so upset about my will. You shouldn't worry. Like Lanyon, who disappointed me about my ideas, which he named rubbish." "I never approved of your will," pursued Utterson, regardless of the changed topic. "My will? Yes, surely, I know that," said the doctor. "You have told me so." The lawyer insisted. "I have learned something about young Hyde." The large and handsome face of Dr. Jekyll got pale to the very lips. He seemed worried. And then he got angry. "I don't want to hear any more about this," said he. "This is a matter which we shouldn't talk about again," I thought. "What I heard was horrible," the lawyer said. "It can make no difference. You do not understand me," the doctor replied. "My situation is a painful one. Utterson, my position is really strange. We can't mend it by talking." "Jekyll," said Utterson, "you know me. You should trust me. I can help you get rid of it." "My friend Utterson," said the doctor, "this is very good to hear. This is absolutely good of you, and I can't find words to thank you. I completely believe you. I would trust you before any man, even myself. However, I will tell you one thing. Any time I want, I can get rid of Mr. Hyde easily. You must see this. Yet, I thank you again and again. And I will just say one more thing, Utterson, that I'm sure you understand that this is a private matter and want you to keep it as a secret." Utterson reflected a little, looking at the fire. "I'm sure that you are perfectly right," he said at last. "Okay, but since we have touched upon this matter, and I hope, for the last time," the doctor went on, "there remained one more thing that I want you to understand. I really have a great interest in my friend, poor Hyde. He told me that he and you have seen each other, and I fear he was rude. Despite everything I do, sincerely take a very great interest in that young man. And if I die, Utterson, I want you to promise me that you will do anything for him to gain his rights. I think you would. You should understand it is very important for me. Please, promise." "I can't pretend that I will like him," Mr. Utterson said. "I don't ask that," rejected Jekyll, laying his hand on Utterson's arm. "I only ask for justice. I only ask you to help him when I die or disappear." Utterson sighed, as if he would accept. "Okay, my friend," he said. "I promise." Chapter 4. The CAREW Murder Case. About a year later, on October 18th, London was surprised by a brutal crime. The details of the crime were few but shocking. A maid living alone in a house near the river had gone upstairs to sleep at about 11 o'clock. Although the city was covered with fog in the late hours, in the early part of the night there were no clouds, and the track which the maid's window was looking at was lightened greatly by the full moon. It seemed that she had some romantic feelings as she sat down upon her box and fell into a dream of musing. Never, she used to say when narrating that experience while crying, never had she felt more with certainty with all men or thought more kindly of the world. And as she sat she noticed an old handsome gentleman with white hair walking along the lane, and moving forward to meet him another and very small man, to whom at first she didn't notice much. When they had come within speech, the maid could easily see them, the older man approached the other with a very kind manner of politeness. Indeed, it didn't seem as if the subject of his address was very important. Actually, from his pointing, it somehow appeared as if he were only asking questions about his way. But the moon shone on his face while he was speaking, and the girl was glad to watch it. Suddenly, her eyes looked to the other, and she was startled to recognize him. She was sure that he was Mr. Hyde, who had once visited her master. For him she had conceived a dislike. He had a heavy cane in his hand, with which he was playing, but he never answered a word, and seemed to listen with an unusual impatience. Suddenly he exploded with a great flame of anger, stamping his foot, shook the stick, and went on, as the servant described it, like a madman. The old gentleman took a step back, with a look of surprise and a bit of hurt, and at that moment Mr. Hyde stopped all the bounds and clubbed him to the earth. At the next moment, with ape-like fury, he was going on beating his victim mercilessly, the effect of which caused the shattering sounds of the bones to be heard, and also the sound of the body when jumped upon the street. With the result of these sights and sounds, the maid passed out. It was 2 o'clock when she sobered up and decided to call the police. The murderer had gone long ago, but there still was his victim in the middle of the lane, with an incredibly deformed body. The stick with which the act had been done, although it was made of some kind of a rare, very tough and heavy wood, stood broken in the middle due to the stress of this inhuman cruelty, and one broken off into half had rolled somewhere near. The other, certainly, had been lost with the inhuman murderer. A purse and gold watch were found on the victim, but nobody was able to find cards or papers, except a tightly closed and stamped envelope. Probably he had been carrying it to the post. On the envelope, there wrote the name and address of Mr. Utterson. This was brought to Mr. Utterson the next morning, before he woke up. As soon as he saw it and was told about the events, he shot out a solemn lip. "I won't say anything until I have seen the victim," he said. "This may be very serious. Can you please wait for me while I put on my clothes?" And with the same grave mood, he hurried during his breakfast and drove right to the police station, to the place where the body had been moved. As soon as he came into the cell, he nodded. "Yes," he said, "I know him. Unfortunately, this is Sir Danvers Carew." "Oh, my God," said the officer. He was shocked. "Is it possible?" And then, "This will be a shocking effect," he said, "and perhaps you can help us about the man." And he summarized what the maid had seen, and showed the stick, which was broken due to the event. The lawyer had already quailed at the name of Hyde, but when he saw the stick, all the doubts of him got lost. He recognized the stick as he was the one who had given it to Henry Jekyll many years before. "Is this Mr. Hyde a short man?" he asked. "Especially small and especially evil-looking. This is what the maid calls him," said the officer. Mr. Utterson stared, and then, looking at the officer, "If you can come with me," he said, "I think I can take you where he lives." When these were the case, it was about 9 in the morning, and the first fog of the season could be seen. The wind was successively blowing in routing mist, which was ready to battle, so that as the cab went from street to street, Mr. Utterson observed a great number of degrees and hues of twilight. He just stared at the sky, and here, for a moment, the fog would leave, and a shaft of daylight would shine beautifully. The gloomy side of Soho seen under these changing glimpses, with its muddy streets and roads, and passengers around, and its lamps, seemed, in Mr. Utterson's eyes, like a region of some city in a nightmare. What he was thinking, moreover, were of the gloomiest color, and when he looked at the companion briefly of his drive, he was aware of some bit of that terror of the law and the law's officers. From time to time they may attack the most honest. As the cab went through the direction that the address indicated, the fog lifted a little and showed him a dirty street, a poor palace, a cheap French restaurant, many tattered children who gathered in the doorways, and many women of many people from different nations passing out, key in their hand. And afterwards the fog came again upon that part, browner than ever, and separated him from his rascally surroundings. This was Henry Jekyll's favorite home, the owner of which was a man who inherited £250,000 sterling. An old woman opened the door. She had an evil-looking face, yet it was smoothed by insincerity. But her behaviors were excellent. Yes, she said, this was Mr. Hyde's home, but he was not present at the moment. He already had begun very late. Despite this, he had left home again in less than an hour. Indeed, it was not something strange, as his habits were pretty irregular, and he was often absent. For example, she hadn't seen him for about 2 months, until yesterday. "Okay, then, we'd like to see his rooms," the lawyer said. And when the woman explained that it was impossible, "Let me tell you who this person is," he said. "This is Inspector Newcomer of Scotland Yard." A flash of detestable joy appeared on the woman's face. "Ah," she said, "he is in a difficult situation. What has he done?" Mr. Utterson and the inspector looked at each other. "He doesn't seem a very popular person," said the inspector. "And now, you kind lady, please let me and this gentleman look around." Mr. Hyde had used only few rooms in this house, but they were luxuriously furnished, seemed very elegant, luxurious, and in good taste. A special closet was full of wine. The plate was made of silver, the napery elegant. There were beautiful pictures on the wall. One of them was a gift, as Utterson supposed, from Henry Jekyll, who could be called an expert, and the carpets were of many piles and pleasant in color. At this moment, however, the rooms had every mark of having been recently and hastily ransacked. There were clothes laid on the floor, with their pockets inside out. Everything looked pretty untidy. On the fireplace there were some gray ashes, as if many papers had been burned. From these, the inspector unearthed some important points. He found out a checkbook, which had resisted the fire. The other half of the stick was found too. It was behind the door, and as now he was sure of his thoughts. The officer said that he was not delighted. His satisfaction was completed by a visit to the bank, in which thousands of pounds were found in the account of the murderers. "You may depend on it," he told Mr. Utterson. "I've got him. He must have gone crazy. Otherwise he never would have left the stick, or, beyond everything else, burned the checkbook. Money is life to the man. The only thing we have to do is to wait for him at the bank, and take out the notices." However, the last one was not so easy to accomplish, as Mr. Hyde had been confirmed by few familiars. Even the maid had seen him only 2 times. His family could not be traced. He had no photograph, and the few who could describe him had contradictory statements, as common observers will. Just only on one point did they agree, and that was the evil looks of him, which were unforgettable. Chapter 5. Incident of the Letter. In the afternoon, Mr. Utterson found his way to Dr. Jekyll's house, in which he was admitted by Poole before, and taken to the kitchen offices, and behind the house to the building which was known as the laboratory or examination room. The doctor had been known to have bought the house from the inheritor of a famous surgeon. It was the first time that Mr. Utterson had been admitted to friends' quarters, and he stared at the dirty, windowless structure inquisitively and gazed round with an unpleasant sense of strangeness as he crossed the theater. The theater was once crowded with eager students all around. However, now he examined it closely. Mr. Utterson was at last admitted into the doctor's room. It was quite a large room, equipped with glass cupboards, furnished, amongst the rest, with a cheval glass, and there was a business table, and looking out upon the court by 3 windows, dirty with dust, covered with iron. The fire burned in the fireplace. A lamp was on the chimney shelf, and there, beside the fire, sat Dr. Jekyll, looking pale and ill. He did not stand up to meet his friend, his visitor, but by giving a cold hand welcomed in a changed voice. "And now," said Mr. Utterson, immediately when the servant had left them, "have you heard the news?" The doctor was startled. "People were shouting about it in the square," he said. "I heard them in my dining room." "Just a word," Mr. Utterson said. "CAREW was my client. However, you are my client too, and I want to know what I am doing. Please tell me if you have tried enough to hide this fellow." "My friend, I swear to God," the doctor cried, "I swear to God I will never go on with my interest in him again. I promise you that I am done with him in this world. I'll never see him again. It is all at an end. And actually, he doesn't want me to help him. You do not know him as I do. He is safe. He is completely safe. Pay attention to my words. No one will be talking about him." The lawyer listened sadly. He did not like his friend's excited manner. "You seem to trust him so much," he said. "I hope you won't be in trouble. If it came to court, your name could appear." "I am quite sure of him," Jekyll replied confidently. "I have good reasons for certainty that I cannot tell anyone else. However, there is just a thing on which you might give me advice. I have been sent a letter, and I am confused whether I should talk about it to the police. I should like to give it in your hands. Utterson, you could judge smartly, I'm sure. I have great trust in you. You fear, I suppose, That it might lead him to be found? The lawyer inquired. No, the lawyer said. I don't care what happens to Hyde. I am quite finished with him. I was thinking of my own reputation. The lawyer was surprised at his friend's self-centeredness, but quite relieved by it, though. Okay, he said finally. Give me the letter. The letter was written in a strange hand, and the name on it was Edward Hyde. It expressed in short enough that the writer's benefactor, Dr. Jekyll, had opportunity to escape unharmed. The lawyer actually liked this letter. It was more intimate than he had looked for, thus now being shamed of his past suspicions. Where is the envelope? He asked. I burned it, Jekyll replied. It was before I thought what I came across. Yet it had no postmark. The letter was brought by hand. Can I keep this and think about it? Utterson asked. I wish you to think and decide for me, replied his client. I have lost my confidence. Well, I'll think about it, Utterson returned. And now just one thing. Was it Hyde who got you to write the terms in your will about that disappearance thing? The doctor seemed worried. He shut his mouth tight and nodded. I knew it, Utterson said. He wanted to murder you. You're lucky that you escaped. I have had what is far more to the purpose, the doctor declared sadly. I've now learned my lesson. Oh my God, Utterson, what a lesson I have had. And he covered his face with his hands. On his way out, the lawyer stopped and said a few words to the servant. He said, There was a letter brought today. What was the person who brought it like? But Poole said that the letter was brought by a postman. This news led the lawyer to reconsider his fears. Clearly, the letter had arrived by the laboratory door. Possibly it had been written in the cabinet, so it must be differently handled cautiously. While he was going, the newsboys were shouting along the streets, Special publication! Terrible murder of an MP! One of his friends and clients was killed, and the life and good name of another could be lost in the current of the scandal. It was, at least, a very important decision that he had to make. As a person who did not normally ask for advice from others, he changed his mind. Also, this matter was different. Right after that, he sat with Mr. Guest, his clerk, beside the other. There was a bottle of an old wine that had long been kept unopened in the foundations of that building. The weather was still foggy, but the people inside the room enjoyed the firelight. The acid in the bottle had dissolved a long time before. There was indeed no one from whom he kept fewer secrets than Mr. Guest, and not every time. He was sure that he kept as many as he meant. Guest was known to have often been on business with the doctor. He knew Poole. He could barely have failed to know that Mr. Hyde was familiar to the house. He might come to a decision. Since Guest was a great student and expert of handwriting, would he consider the step natural and obliging? The clerk was a man whom people asked for advice. He could hardly read strange documents without making a remark, and with the help of that remark, the lawyer could shape his future direction. This is sad business about Sir Danvers, he said. Yes, it is indeed. It has brought out public feeling so much, Mr. Guest said. He was, of course, a really mad man. I would like to hear your thoughts on this issue, returned the lawyer. I have got a paper in his handwriting. Only you and I know this, for I don't really know what to do about this. It is an unpleasant thing under the best conditions. But there it is, quite in your way. A murderer's handwritten signature. Guest's eyes brightened and he sat down immediately and studied it with excitement. No, sir, he is not mad. But it is a strange hand, he said. And without doubt a very strange writer, the lawyer said. At that moment the servant came with a note. Is that from Dr. Jekyll, sir? The clerk asked. I thought I was familiar to the writing. Anything in privacy, Mr. Utterson? It's only an invitation to dinner. For what reason? Would you like to see it? Just a moment. Thank you, sir. And the clerk placed the 2 pieces of paper beside and assiduously compared the texts. Thank you, sir, he said finally, returning them. It's a very interesting handwriting. After a brief pause, Mr. Utterson experienced an inner conflict. He suddenly asked, "Why did you compare them, guest?" "Well, sir," replied the clerk, "there's a rather singular similarity. Both samples are exactly alike in many ways." "So strange," said Utterson. "Exactly," returned Guest. "You won't be telling anyone about this, okay?" asked the master. "No, sir," replied the clerk. When he was alone, Mr. Utterson locked the note into his strong-box. "What?" he thought. "Henry Jekyll forged for a murderer?" All his body felt a strange fear. Chapter 6. Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon. Time continued to pass. Thousands of pounds were offered as an award for the death of Sir Danvers. But Mr. Hyde had no sign to be found out, as if he had never existed. Much of his past was uncovered, actually, and all discreditable. Stories came out of the man's brutality, at once so unsympathetic, of his morally corrupted life, of his strange associates, of the hatred which encompassed his career, but of his current location, not a sign. After he had left the house in Soho on the morning of the murder, he clearly went out of sight, and progressively, as time passed, Mr. Utterson began to calm down and to get more tranquil. The death of Mr. Danvers was, in his opinion, more than penalized for by the disappearance of Mr. Hyde. Now that the nasty effect had been pulled back, a new life began for Dr. Jekyll. He came out of his solitude, restored relations with his friends, and while he had always been known to be a generous man, he now started to go to church. He was busy, spending time in the open air. He did well. He recovered from his old, sick appearance, and for more than 2 months the doctor enjoyed this peace. On the 8th of January, the lawyer was invited to a small party at the doctor's. Lanyon had been there, and the face of the doctor had looked as it did in the old days when the trio was indivisible. On the 12th, and again on the 14th, however, visitors were not accepted into the house. "The doctor imprisoned himself to the house," Poole said, "and saw no one." On the 15th, Utterson tried again, and was again rejected. Having spent the last 2 months seeing his friend almost daily, he was surprised with this solitude. On the 5th night, he invited guests to dinner, and on the 6th night, he went to Dr. Lanyon's. Eventually, he was not refused there. He was surprised with the change that affected the appearance of the doctor. His face could be read to understand the desperate situation in which the doctor was. The joyful man had grown pale. He didn't look positive anymore. He was obviously balder and got older, and seemed sick. It was improbable that the doctor would have judged his death, and that was what Utterson was directed to have doubt about. And when Utterson noticed his ill looks, it was certain that Lanyon declared himself a desperate man. "I have had a shock," he said, "and I can never get well again. It's been a question for weeks. Well, my life has been good. I liked it. Yes, I used to like it. I occasionally think if we knew all, we should feel happier to leave." "Jekyll is sick too," remarked Utterson. "Have you seen him?" But Lanyon's appearance changed, and he said that he wished to see or hear no more of Dr. Jekyll. He said this loudly and in an unsteady tone. "I don't want to see him any more, and I beg that you will not talk about someone whom I regard as dead." "Oh," said Mr. Utterson, and then after he waited a while. "Maybe I can do something," he said. "We are 3 very old friends, Lanyon. We don't have a lifetime to make others." "It's impossible to do anything," replied Lanyon. "Ask him." "He doesn't want to see me," said the lawyer. "Not surprising," was the reply given. "After I die, you might perhaps come to learn the right and wrong of this, one day. I can't say. And meanwhile, if we can talk about other things, stay and do so. But if you cannot stop yourself to talk about this damned topic, then get out. I can't bear it." Immediately when he got home, the lawyer sat down and wrote to Jekyll, expressing his feelings about his refusal from the house, and asking about the reason for this unpleasant break with Lanyon. And the next day he received a long answer, mostly written pitiably, and in some parts mysteriously. The friendship with Lanyon was impossible to be restored. "I'm not angry with our old friend," Jekyll wrote, "but I agree with him that we must never meet again. From now on, I'll have a life of extreme isolation. Please don't be startled, and you mustn't doubt my friendship. If I go on refusing you, you must allow me to go my own gloomy way. I made mistakes for which I now suffer, and a danger that I can't identify. I didn't think that this earth had such unmanning sufferings, and you should respect my silence." Utterson was astonished. The dark effect of Hyde had been pulled back. The doctor had returned to his old habits and friendly ties. A week ago, however, now suddenly friendship and peace of mind and the whole current of his life were destroyed. Such an immense and sudden change indicated madness, but remembering Lanyon's manner and words, he thought there must be something mysterious. After a week, Dr. Lanyon was very ill, confined to his bed, and in a time less than 2 weeks he died. After the funeral, at night, Utterson locked the door of his room, and there, sitting by the light of a candle, melancholically took an envelope, the address on which was written by hand with the stamp of his dead friend, "Private, for G.J. Utterson alone," and the lawyer was worried about its contents. "There was the funeral of one of my friends," he thought. "What if this should cost another?" And then he denounced the fear as unfaithfulness and broke the seal. Yet, in it there was another envelope, also sealed, and it was marked as "shouldn't be opened till the death or disappearance of Dr. Henry Jekyll." Utterson could not believe in his eyes. Yes, the same word disappearance, here again, were the idea of a disappearance and the name of Henry Jekyll in brackets. He got very curious, to immediately get to the bottom of these mysteries, regardless of the prohibition. Yet he was an honest man, and faith to his dead friend prevented him from disregarding his obligations. So he put the packet in the innermost corner of his safe box. He wanted to speak with Poole. Poole had, actually, no good news to express. It was observed that the doctor now, more than ever, imprisoned himself to his laboratory, where he would sometimes even sleep. He was depressed, very silent. He didn't read. It seemed as if something in his mind made him so. Utterson got so accustomed to the character of refusals that he decreased the frequency of his visits, little by little. Chapter 7. Incident at the Window. On Sunday, when Mr. Utterson was on his usual walk, he encountered Mr. Enfield, and their walk led them through the by-street, and when they were in front of the door, both stopped and looked at it. "Well," Enfield said, "the story has finished. We'll never see Mr. Hyde any more." "I hope the same," the lawyer said. "Have I ever told you that I once saw him and felt the same feeling of disgust?" Enfield agreed, and added, "And by the way, you should have told me that this was a back way to Dr. JEKYLL'S." "So now you know, don't you?" said Utterson. "But if it is so, we may walk to the court and have a look at the windows. To be honest, I am uncomfortable about poor Jekyll, and even outside, it seems as if the presence of a friend might do him good." The court was cold and a little wet. One of the windows was half opened, and sitting close to it, taking in the air with a sad appearance, like a prisoner, Utterson saw Dr. Jekyll. "What? Jekyll?" He was startled. "I believe you are better." "I am in a great depression, Utterson," replied the doctor gloomily, very low. "It won't last long, I hope." "You have imprisoned yourself here," said the lawyer. "You should go out, like Mr. Enfield and me. Come on, let's go out." "You are very good," the other said. "I would like to so much. However, no, it is really impossible. But indeed, Utterson, I am very happy that you're here. This is really a great pleasure. I would like to admit you inside, but here is really not fit." "Why don't we?" said the lawyer, kindly. "Stay down here and speak with you from where we are." "That's a good idea," replied the doctor with a smile. His face expressed his hopelessness as it froze the blood of the two men below. They saw it but for a moment, for the windows were instantly shut down. But that brief view had been enough to understand, and they turned and left the court without speaking. In silence they crossed the by-street, and it was not until they had come into a neighboring highway that Mr. Utterson eventually turned his head and looked at Mr. Enfield. They both felt sick, and a great horror in their eyes was observable. God forgive us, prayed Mr. Utterson. But his companion only nodded his head very seriously and walked on once more without a word. Chapter 8. The Last Night. Mr. Utterson was sitting near his fireplace one evening after dinner when a surprising visit came from Poole. "Bless me, Poole, what's the reason that made you come here?" he cried. And then, looking at him again, "What's the problem?" he added. "Is the doctor ill?" "Mr. Utterson," the man said, "there is a problem." "Have a seat, and here is a glass of wine for you," Mr. Utterson said. "Now, please tell me in a clear manner, what do you want?" "You know his behaviors, sir," replied Poole, "and how he confines himself. Well, he's imprisoned again in his room, and I'm worried about him, sir. Mr. Utterson, sir, I'm afraid." "Now, my good man," said Mr. Utterson, "say it clearly. What makes you afraid?" "It's been a week," replied Poole, persistently ignoring the question, "and I can't bear any more." Poole's appearance greatly accompanied his words. It was the first time that he had announced his fear. He had never turned his eyes into the lawyer's face. Even now, he sat with the glass of wine that he still hadn't tasted, looking at the corner of the floor. "I can't bear any more," he expressed again. "Well," Mr. Utterson said, "I think this is a very serious matter. Poole, I see there is something seriously wrong. Please tell me, what is it?" "I think there's a dangerous game," replied Poole harshly. "Dangerous game?" cried the lawyer. "What dangerous game? What do you mean? Say it clearly." "I don't dare, sir," was the reply. "But can you come with me and see it yourself?" Mr. Utterson replied by standing up and taking his hat and greatcoat, but he saw the great relief that appeared on the servant's face. It was a cold, normal night of March. The wind seemed to have swept the streets extraordinarily without passengers, besides. For Mr. Utterson thought he had never seen that part of London so abandoned. The street, when they arrived, was full of wind and dust. Poole, who had kept all the way 1 or 2 steps ahead, now stopped in the middle of the pavement, and despite of the harsh weather, took his hat and cleaned his brow with a red pocket handkerchief. He spoke, harsh and broken. "Well, sir," he said, "we've arrived, and I hope there is nothing wrong." "I hope, Poole," said the lawyer. Therefore, Poole knocked in a very cautious manner. The door was opened, and a voice asked inside, "Is that you, Poole?" "It's all right," said Poole. "Can you open the door?" When they entered, it was easy to observe that the hall was brightly lit up, the fire was built high, and there was a crowd of all the servants near one another. The maid abruptly started to cry hysterically, and the cook began, "Bless God, it's Mr. Utterson!" approached running as though to hug him. "Are you all there?" said the lawyer angrily. "Very irregular, very improper. Your master won't be pleased." "They're all frightened," Poole said. No one spoke for a while. The maid then cried loudly. "Don't say anything," Poole said to her. They had all begun and changed their direction towards the inner door with faces of horrible expectation. "And now," went on the head servant, pointing the knife boy, "we'll go to the end of there immediately." And then he pleaded Mr. Utterson to pursue him, and guided him to the back garden. "Now, sir," he said, "you come as slowly as you can. I want you to hear, but keep silent. And see here, sir, if unexpectedly he wants to admit you inside. Don't go." Mr. Utterson recollected his courage and went after the head servant into the laboratory room by way of the surgical theater, to the foot of the step. Here Poole told him to stop and listen, while he himself, making a great and obvious call on his resolution, ascending the stairs, and knocked on the cabinet door with an uncertain manner. "The lawyer, sir, wants to see you," he said. A voice replied inside the room. "I can't see anyone," it said complainingly. "Okay, sir," replied Poole, with a sign of something like victory in his voice, and taking his candle back, he guided Mr. Utterson back to the other side of the yard and into the kitchen. "Sir," he said, looking at the lawyer in the eyes, "it seems the voice belongs to someone else." "A very different voice," replied the lawyer. He was very pale. "Different? Well, yes, I agree," said the head servant. "I'm sure that this is a horrible deceit. This is not his voice, sir. Master's killed. He was finished 8 days ago, while he was crying out, begging God, and now there's someone else inside, instead of him, Mr. Utterson." "It's a very strange story, Poole. Quite a wild story, my man," Mr. Utterson said, biting his finger. "Consider as a possibility that it were as you think, assuming the doctor to have been, well, killed. What could get the murderer to stay here? That wouldn't sound logical. It doesn't have any logical point." "Well, sir, you won't believe, but I'll do it anyway," Poole said. "Last week, he cried every day for some chemicals. Sometimes the master wrote his orders on a sheet of paper and threw it on the stairs. However, this week there was nothing but papers. Well, sir, several times a day he ordered and complained, and I have gone to all the chemists in town. Every time I brought them back, another ordered to return it, as it was not pure, and one more order to another firm. This drug is wanted terribly bad, sir, whatever for." "Do you have any of these papers?" asked the lawyer. In his pocket, Poole took out a crumpled note, for which Mr. Utterson approached nearer to the candle and examined it carefully. It contained the following lines: "Dr. Jekyll assures that the last sample is impure and thus useless for his current objective. In the year 18, Dr. Jekyll bought quite a large amount, and he now wants them to be searched carefully, and should any of the same quality be left, send them to him immediately. It is an urgent need." "This is an odd note," said Mr. Utterson. "The chemist was so angry, sir, and he threw it back to me like dirt," replied Poole. "This is undeniably the doctor's handwriting, do you know?" asked the lawyer. "Yes, I thought so," he returned slowly, and then, with another voice, "But its importance is null," he said. "I've seen him." "What?" said Mr. Utterson in a surprised manner. "Seen him?" repeated he. "This is it," said Poole. "It was in this manner. From the garden, I came to the theater at once. Apparently, he had moved out to look for the drug mentioned, or whatever reason, and there he was at the end of the room, looking for something among the crates. Seeing me, he gave a kind of cry, and moved suddenly upstairs into the cabinet. If it was my master, why had he worn a mask? If it was my master, why did he run from me, shouting like a rat? And then—" The man paused. "These are all very unusual factors," said the lawyer. "But I think it is clearer now. Dr. Jekyll, my good man, is simply struck with one of those diseases that inflicts excruciating pain and deforms the victim, thus alters his voice. It explains the mask and avoidance of his friends, hence his great wish to find that drug, by which the poor doctor keeps some hope of ultimate recovery. This is my explanation. It is sorrowful enough, Poole, and frightening to consider, but it is simple and quite natural. No need to be extremely alarmed." "Sir," said the head servant, "it was not my master. I've been with my master for years. My master," began to whisper, "is a tall, well-built man, and this is extremely short." The lawyer attempted to object. "Oh, sir," shouted Poole, "I said I've been with my master for 20 years. Is it possible, you think, that I do not know where his head comes to in the cabinet door, where I saw him every day in 20 years? No, sir, that thing in the mask can't be Dr. Jekyll. God knows what it was, but it can't be Dr. Jekyll, and I frankly believe he was killed." "Poole," returned the lawyer, "as you know, it is my duty to make all clear. Although I want to spare your master's feelings, though I am confused by this note, which seems to prove him still alive, I will consider it my duty to break in this door." "Ah, sir, that's talking," shouted Poole. "And for the second problem," went on Utterson, "who can do this?" "Oh, you and me, Mr. Utterson," was the fearless reply. "That's good to hear," returned Mr. Utterson. "And even in the worst condition, it is my duty to see you are no loser." "There is an axe in the theatre," said Poole. Mr. Utterson took that harsh but weighty thing into his hand, holding it firmly. "Do you know, Poole," he said, lifting his eyes, "that you and I are preparing to put ourselves in a very risky position?" "You may say so, sir, surely," Poole replied. "Okay, then we should be straightforward," said the other. "We give more importance to thinking than talking, so let's make a full confession. This masked thing that you saw, can you recognize it?" "Well, Mr. Utterson, it went so rapidly, and that thing was so doubled up, that it's almost impossible to swear to that," was the reply given by Poole. "But if you are asking whether it was Mr. Hyde?" "Oh, yes, in my opinion it was." "You can infer it had nearly the same bigness, and it also had the same fast, light way with it. And at the same time, who else could have entered by the laboratory door? You still know, Mr. Utterson, at the time of murder he had got the keys with him? But there are more. I have no knowledge, Mr. Utterson, if you have ever seen this Mr. Hyde." "Yes," Mr. Utterson said. "One time I spoke with him." "So you probably know, in addition to the rest of us, that there was something strange about that man. I'm not sure how to express it, sir. Moreover, that you felt in your marrow kind of cold and thin." "Exactly. I feel something like what you expressed," said Mr. Utterson. "Absolutely, sir," Poole returned. "So, when that masked creature jumped like a monkey from within the chemicals and moved into the cabinet, I felt exactly the same. Oh, I know it doesn't prove this, Mr. Utterson. I'm learned enough for that. But sometimes mankind feels, and I swear you, in the name of God, it was Mr. Hyde." "Oh, Jesus," said the lawyer. "My fears indicate the same point. Evil, I'm afraid of that connection. Oh, really, I believe you. I believe poor Harry was murdered, and I believe whoever killed him, for whatever God knows, is still there, in his victim's room. Well, our name is now Vengeance." Then the footman came. He was very white and nervous. "Be brave," said Mr. Utterson. "It is now determined to make an end of this. Poole, here, breaking the door, you and I are going to enter the cabinet. Meanwhile, lest anything should really be wrong, you and the boy must go just beyond the corner with a pair of sticks and take your position at the door. You have 10 minutes. And now, Poole, let us get to ours," the lawyer said, and went into the yard. It was now quite dark. The wind was blowing, tossing the light of the candle back and forth, until they entered into the theatre, where they were protected from the wind. Then they took their seats silently to wait. London murmured solemnly, but close by, the silence was only broken by the sounds of a footstep moving back and forth in the direction of the cabinet floor. "Oh, what can be worse than burying him as he stays here? Ah, sir, there's a disgusting feeling in every footstep of it. But give head again, a bit closer. Please listen and tell me, Mr. Utterson, is that the doctor's foot?" Poole asked. The tone of the footsteps was light and strange, as all were slow. It was really different from the heavy creaking walking of Henry Jekyll. Utterson exhaled loudly in sorrow. "Anything else to tell me?" asked he. Poole nodded. "One time," he said, "I heard it weeping." "Weeping? How?" asked Mr. Utterson with horror. "Like a woman or a hopeless child," replied the other. This made me so sad that I could have wept too. But now the 10 minutes had passed. Poole took the axe. The candle was on the nearest table to light them for the assault. "Jekyll!" shouted the lawyer loudly. "I want to see you." He stopped a moment. However, silence was the only reply. "This is serious, and I must see you," he continued. "If you don't let me in, I'll enter then by brute force." "Utterson," was the reply, "for heaven's sake, I want to be alone." "Ah, this is not the doctor. It is Hyde's voice," shouted Utterson. "Break down the door." Poole took the axe, and the blow was quite powerful. A scream, as of an animal, came from the cabinet. Trying for several times, they at last were successful. The lock burst, and the wreck of the door fell inside. They looked around. There was the cabinet before their eyes, a comfortable room with a good fire, kettle, and papers neatly placed on the work table, pretty quiet room. In the middle there was the body of a man. It was contorted and still moving. They came closer carefully, looked at the face of Edward Hyde. He had put on clothes that were too large for him. The size of the clothes, a large size, was like that of the doctor's. Utterson knew that was the body of the self-destroyer. "Too late, my good man," he said sharply, "to rescue or punish. We now have nothing to do with Hyde. The only duty is now to find the body of your master." The theater occupied the largest proportion of the building. They examined the cabinets, corridor, and other details of the building. Each needed nothing but a look, as all were empty. They looked for other places without hope. They were not able to find any trace of Henry Jekyll, dead or alive. Poole looked at Mr. Utterson. "He must be buried here," he said, paying attention to the sound. "Or he may have escaped," said Utterson, and he turned to check the door. The door was locked, yet with the key near it, however stained with rust. "It can't have been used," observed Mr. Utterson. "Used?" repeated Poole. "It is broken as though a man had stroked on it." "Let us go back to the cabinet," Mr. Utterson proposed. They ascended the steps silently, with a glance at the dead body, moved forward to inspect what the cabinet had. At one side, traces of chemical work were noticeable. On glass saucers there were white materials like powder. It seemed as if they were for an experiment. "That is the chemical that I used to bring him," Poole said. Then, going near the fireside, there observed various books on a shelf, and Utterson was astonished to find a copy of a work in the doctor's own handwriting with startling blasphemies. Next, they encountered the big mirror, and they couldn't understand why Dr. Jekyll used it. Turning to the business table, they saw among the papers a large envelope in Jekyll's handwriting, written for Mr. Utterson. The lawyer opened it, and several additional envelopes fell to the carpet. The first one wrote that, in case of death or disappearance, the heir would be Gabriel John Utterson. "I feel dizzy," he said. Hyde has been here for days, and I have difficulty understanding the reason for which he didn't destroy this document while he had no cause to, like me." He held the next paper, looking at the date on it. "Oh, Poole!" the lawyer shouted. "It was written today. He must be alive. He must have escaped. Or a suicide. Oh, we must be careful." "Why don't you read the paper, sir?" the butler asked. "As I fear," was the answer, and he started to read. "Dear Utterson, when you read this letter, I'll have disappeared. I'm not able to foresee, but my instinct tells me that the end is inevitable and must be early. Then go home and first read the narrative by Lanyon, and if you desire to hear more, then read the confession of your unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll." Was there a third additional document?" asked the lawyer. "Here, sir," said Poole, giving the package. The lawyer took it and went home to solve the mystery. Chapter 9. Dr. Lanyon's Narrative. On the 9th of January, I received an envelope from Henry Jekyll, which really surprised me. The contents increased this feeling. The letter was as follows. "Dear Lanyon, you are one of my oldest friends. Despite some scientific disagreements, we have never had bad relations. And now, Lanyon, my life, my honor, are all in your hands. Postponing any other engagements for tonight, take a cab, come straight to my house. My butler Poole was ordered to help you with a locksmith. Go alone and force open my cabinet. Break the lock and get all its contents as they stand from the 4th drawer. There are some powders, a feel, and a paper book. I beg you, please carry it back exactly as is to your home. And afterwards come back before midnight. Being alone, admit a man to whom you will give the drawer. That's all. I'll be grateful to you. H.J. P.S. This is crucial for me. Should you fail, I'm finished." After reading those lines, I thought my friend was insane, yet as I felt bound to do as he requested, so I did. After driving straight to Jekyll's house, I saw the butler was awaiting my arrival, with the same letter of instruction and the locksmith. We directly moved to old Mr. Denman's surgical theater, and then arrived at the door of the cabinet, which was very strong. The lock was excellent, and after 2 hours' work, we were able to open the door. I took out the drawer and drove home immediately. Here I went on checking its contents. The powders were neat, but like Jekyll's private manufacture. And inside of a book, which was an ordinary version, there was written a series of dates. These included a period of many years, yet the dates abruptly stopped about a year ago. Single words were noted near dates, like double, occurring perhaps 6 times in all entries. In the beginning, some marks read, "Total failure." They were the notes of experiments, I thought. Yet, what could be the relation between these things and his honor or life? What was the reason of this visit from his messenger? In case it should pose me some security threats, I loaded an old pistol. The knocker sounded on the door. Opening the door, I found a small man on the other side. "Are you coming from Dr. Jekyll?" I asked. He nodded. A really strange man, I thought. After inviting him inside, finally, I was able to see him clearly. He was a small man, with a strikingly shocking expression on his face. He seemed extremely strong. His clothes were funny, although they were expensive and of rich fabric. It could be observed that they were enormously too large for him. Yet his looks were very evil, and he was like a creature. When I thought about this, my visitor was, actually, on fire with somber excitement. "Have you got it?" he shouted. "Have you got it?" His impatience made him place his hand upon my arm and shake me. With his touch, I felt a certain icy pain in my blood. "Come, sir," I said. "You have not introduced yourself yet. Please sit." "I'm sorry, Dr. Lanyon," he said politely enough. I have been sent here by your colleague, Dr. Henry Jekyll, for a very important business, and I understood—" He was having difficulty in speaking. "I understood a drawer." "There it is, sir," I said suddenly, pointing to the drawer. It lay on the floor, covered with a sheet. He nearly jumped onto it and then stopped, and put his hand upon his heart. I could hear his teeth rub with the convulsive movement of his jaws, and his face seemed so dreadful that I was worried both about his life and reason. "Calm down," I said. He looked at me with a horrible smile, and then, in a tone that was already moderately well under control, "Do you have a graduated glass?" he asked. I stood up and gave him what he requested. He expressed gratitude with a smiling gesture. Then he measured out a little bit of red tincture and supplemented one of the powders. The mixture, which was at first reddish, started gradually to brighten in color, bubbled audibly, and gave off small fumes of vapor. Simultaneously, the ebullition stopped, and the mixture changed to dark purple, then to watery green. My visitor, watching all of this with keen eyes, smiled and looked at me. "And now, shall I take this glass and leave your house without further delay, or will you watch me? Think before you answer, as you are the one who decides." Preferring the former, and being neither richer nor wiser, or preferring the latter, and thus fame and power, in this room, instantly, "Which one?" "Sir," I said, acted as if I were cool, which was far from being the reality. "You speak confusingly, and I think you are mad. Yet I have proceeded too much in those mysterious services to stop before I see the end." "Very well," returned the other. "Lanyon, you remember your promise. You, who have for such a long time been restricted to the most narrow and material views, denying the reality of transcendental medicine, you who have ridiculed your superiors, look!" Then he drank the mixture with one gulp. There he heard a cry. He moved unsteadily, grasped the table tightly, trying to breathe with an open mouth. There came a change. His body seemed to expand. The color of his face soon turned into black, and some features seemed to alter. And afterwards, I had jumped to my feet and jumped back against the wall. I couldn't believe my eyes. "Jesus Christ!" I cried, and "Jesus!" again and again, pale and shocked, and half passed out, like a man returned from death. There stood Henry Jekyll. What I saw and what I heard sickened my soul, and after that sight had faded away, I ask however I can rely on my eyes. I can barely sleep due to this damn event that shook my entire mood. The fatal fear sits near me every time of the day and night, and also I feel my life will not last long. The last thing to say, my good man Utterson, is that, if you can believe it, it will be above and beyond. The creature that came into my house on that day said that he was known by the name of Hyde and was wanted everywhere by the police as the murderer of CAREW. Hasty Lanyon. Chapter 10. Henry Jekyll's Full Statement of the Case. I was born in 18, and the heir of a big fortune, and was very successful due to my hard-working character. And surely the worst of my mistakes was a certain impatient joyousness of disposition. It was hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high and act with a more than usually serious appearance before the public. This caused my pleasures to be concealed, and in the next years I realized that my duplicate character didn't cease to exist. Many could find that shameful, but I wasn't indeed. It was thus the normal nature of my goals rather than faults of my life. In this case, I was compelled by an inner urge to think deeply and seriously on that hard law of life. I certainly was not a hypocrite. Both sides of me were completely serious. and it occurred that the way of my studies, which drove completely towards the mystic and the transcendental, reacted and caused a strong light on this consciousness of the long-lasting war among my members. With each day, and from both sides of my mind, the moral and the intellectual showed themselves. I thus proceeded stably nearer to that fact, by whose partial discovery I have been forced to such a dreadful shipwreck. He was not genuinely one, but genuinely two. Whatever others could say, I, concerning my responsibility, from the nature of my life, advanced unerringly in one direction only. It being on the moral side, I learned to identify the complete and primitive duplicity of man. I was completely both, and from early times I had begun to reflect the possibility of such a miracle on the idea of the separation of these core components. If each could be put in individual personalities, life would be eased of all that was intolerable. The unjust might go his way, delivered from the goals and regret of his more upright twin, and he just could walk loyally and safely on his good way, doing the right and useful things in which he had pleasure. In practice, I managed to make a drug of mixture by which these personalities should be dethroned from their supremacy, and a second form and appearance take the place of the other, nevertheless natural to me because they were only expression and had the stamp of other components in my personality. I was uncertain to apply long before I set this theory to the test of practice. Risk of death was a known issue for me. For any drug that so strongly controlled and shook the core of my identity might, by a little bit of an overdose, thoroughly destroy everything. But the attraction of a discovery so singular and profound finally overcame my worries about its risk. I had long time ago made my chemical solution ready. I bought from a firm of wholesale chemists a great deal of a particular salt, which was the essential for the experiment, and one night I mixed the elements, watched while they boiled, and gave off smoke in the glass, and when the fermentation was ready, I drank the drug. I felt a great pain in my bones and my whole body. It was nearly unbearable. Then this pain began swiftly to decline, and I came to myself as if out of a great illness. I felt something strange, something beyond description, new and unbelievably sweet. Feeling younger, lighter, and happier in body, I was now carefree. I found myself, at the moment of this life, more evil, 10 times more evil, and it seemed strengthening and giving delight to me like wine. Then I suddenly realized that I was now shorter. In the room there was no mirror. I then brought one for the very intention of observing the transformations. The night, however, had finished. It was now morning. The servants of my house were sleeping deeply in this hour naturally, so I decided, flushed as I was with expectation and victory, to dare to go in my new shape to my bedroom without being seen. Crossing the yard, where the constellations looked down upon me, I pondered, with marvel. No one should be able to see me as the first creature of its kind. I passed through the corridors, a stranger in my own house, and will soon enter to my own home, I thought, before I saw for the first time the appearance of Edward Hyde. In fact, I must speak here only about the theory itself, not telling what I know, but that which I think to be most probable. The evil side of my personality, into which I had now transferred the stamping effectiveness, was less strong and less developed than the good which I had just displaced. Again, during my life, of which had been, finally, 90% goodness and control, it had been exercised a lot fewer in degree and much less tired. And therefore, in my opinion, it happened that Edward Hyde was shorter, slighter, and younger than Henry Jekyll. Even as good shone on the appearance of the one, evil was written definitely and plainly on the other. Evil besides, which I must even now believe to be the fatal side of man, had allowed a mark of deformity and decay to remain on that body. Anyway, I looked at that ugly image in the glass. I had no sense of disgust, rather of a leap of welcome. It was me too. I was now looking at a natural and human thing. In my eyes, it now held a more vivid image of the spirit. It seemed more explicit and single than the defective and segmented appearance I had been thus far accustomed to call mine, and until now I was, without a doubt, right. I have seen that when I put on the image of Edward Hyde, none could come near me at first without an observable reservation. This, as I think, was due to the fact that all human beings, as we meet them, are mixed out of good and evil, and Edward Hyde, unique in the position of mankind, was completely evil. I paused but a moment, looking at the mirror. The next and final experiment hadn't yet been attempted. I had to be clear if I had lost Jekyll irreparably and must run away before daylight from a house which was no more mine. I hurried back to my cabinet. I prepared and drank the cup for the second time, again suffered the unbearable pain of transformation, and once again I was with the character, the height, and the face of Henry Jekyll. That night I had come to the critical crossroads. Had I come near my discovery in a more righteous character? Had I risked the research while under the empire of kind or pious goals? All must have been under other circumstances, and from this torment of death and birth I had come out from an angel instead of a fiend. The drug wasn't faulty, and it was not devilish or divine. It made everything upside down, enabling my escape. Like the prisoners of Philippi, that which stood within ran farther. During that period my goodness was inactive. My evil was awakened by ambition, was agile and fast to take to the occasion, and the thing that was projected was Edward Hyde. Therefore, in spite of the fact that I now had two personalities in addition to two separate appearances, one was purely evil, and the other was as yet the old Henry Jekyll, that inappropriate compound of whose change and improvement I had already learned to lose hope. The movement was therefore completely in the direction of the worse. Still, during that period, I had not defeated my disgust to the simplicity of a life of science. I would still be gladly disposed from time to time, and as my pleasures were briefly not worthy of respect, and I was not only well known and highly considered, but growing towards the elderly man, this incoherency of my life was growing more undesirable day by day. My new power allured me up to the time which I fell in slavery. I only needed to use the drug, to take off the body of the noted professor immediately, and to welcome Edward Hyde. Smiling at this idea, I thought it was funny, and I made my arrangements very seriously, taking and furnishing that house in Soho, to which Hyde was followed by the police, and employed a housekeeper for a creature whom I knew well to be silent and unprincipled. On the other hand, I declared to my servants that a Mr. Hyde, I also described him, should get full control and authority of my house in the square, and to avoid mishaps, I made myself known to my second character. Afterwards, I wrote that will to which you extremely opposed, in order that if anything occurred while being Dr. Jekyll, I could live like Edward Hyde without financial deprivation. And thus defended, as I believed, all around, I started to profit by the strange freedom of my position. I didn't manipulate him for his pleasures. I could be in the public eye with a load of nice comfortableness, and immediately, like a schoolboy, take off those clothes and jump into the sea of freedom. It was completely safe for me. Imagine, I did not even exist. Only running away into my laboratory door, in a second or two, I was able to mix and drink the draught that I had always kept ready, and whatever he had done, Edward Hyde would not exist now, and there in his stead, silently at home, trimming the lamp in his study, Henry Jekyll would afford to laugh at suspicion. The delights which I rushed to seek in my costume were, as I have stated before, not worthy of respect. I would barely use a harder term, but the responsibility of Edward Hyde they soon began to turn toward the frighteningly hideous form. When I returned from these trips, I often threw myself in a kind of wonder at my indirect immorality. This thing that was out of my own soul, and whom I let alone to do his good pleasure, became a harmful and sinful person. He was extremely selfish. Henry Jekyll stood sometimes alarmed before the acts of Edward Hyde, but the condition was different from the ordinary laws, and deceitfully relieved the grasp of conscience. It was Hyde, as a result, and Hyde only, who was guilty. Jekyll was not harmful. He restored again his good qualities, which were apparently undamaged. He would even rush, where it was possible, to undo the wickedness caused by Hyde, and thus his conscience had relief. Into the details of the shameful acts at which I thus committed, for even now I can hardly accept that I did it, I have no plan to tell further details. I mean but to indicate the warnings and the following steps with which my harsh criticism approached. I bumped into one accident which, as it brought on no outcome, I won't mention any more. Commitment of brutality to a child aroused against me the fury of a person nearby, whom I recognized the other day in the person of your relative. The doctor and the child's family were like him too. I feared for my life at some moments, and finally, so as to calm down these people, Edward Hyde paid them in a check, on which the name was Henry Jekyll. From the future, I was able to eliminate the danger easily, by opening an account at another bank for Edward Hyde, and I had even supplied my double with a signature. I thought I was now safe and secure. Approximately 2 months before the death of Sir Danvers, I had been out for another adventure, had come back late, and woke the next day in bed with quite strange feelings. It was in vain. I stared around me, all for nothing. An unknown feeling kept persisting that I was not where I was, that I had not woken up where I seemed to be. Smiling to myself, in my psychological way, I began slothfully to investigate the elements of this delusion, sometimes, even as I did so, dropping back into a relaxing morning doze. Then somehow I looked at my hand. Now the hand of Henry Jekyll was well as shape and size. It was large, firm, white and beautiful. But the hand at which I now looked, obviously enough, in the yellow light of a mid-London morning, being half shut, it was thin, ugly, and thickly covered with a swart growth of hair. It was indeed Edward Hyde's hand. I must have looked at it for nearly half a minute, in a shocked mood, shocked as I was in the only stupidity of wonder. Jumping out of my bed, I rushed to the mirror. At the scene that I saw, my blood was changed into something grandly thin and icy. Yes, I slept with the appearance of Dr. Henry Jekyll, yet I had awakened as Edward Hyde. How could it be possible? I asked myself, and then, with another bound of fear, how could I recover? It was well in the morning. The servants had woken up. All my drugs were in my private cabinet. A long trip down 2 pairs of steps, through the back way, across the open court and through the theater, from where I was then standing, horror-struck. I could indeed easily cover my face, but what might be the advantage of that, when I was incapable of hiding the change in my height? And then, with an overwhelming wonderfulness of relief, I remembered that the servants were already accustomed to the coming and going of Hyde. I had soon put on my clothes. I was also able, in clothes of my own size, had soon went by way of the house, where Bradshaw stared and seemed surprised at seeing Mr. Hyde at that early hour and in such a strange array. and minutes later, Dr. Jekyll had come back to his own stature and appearance. He was sitting down, with a serious face, to make a deception of breakfasting. My appetite was actually small. This unaccountable event, this inversion of my previous experience, seemed, like the Babylonian figure on the wall, to be of my verdict, and I began to think more seriously than ever before on the matter and possible outcomes of my double existence. That part of me which I had the power of controlling had recently exercised much and been fed. In my opinion, recently as if the body of Edward Hyde had been bigger in stature, as if, when I was in that shape, I were aware of a more generous flow of blood, and I started to observe a risk that, if this were much extended, the balance of my character could permanently be upside down. The ability of voluntary change might be lost. I could bear Edward Hyde's character irreversibly. The strength of the mixture had not always displayed its outcomes equally. In the past, very early in my profession, it had been totally unsuccessful. From that day on, I had been compelled more than one incident to double, and once, with obvious risk of death, to triple the dose. And these unusual ambiguity had shaped until now the sole shadow on my satisfaction. Now, still, and in the view of that morning's incident, I was obliged to notice that while, at the start, the trouble had been to get rid of Jekyll's body, it had recently, progressively, but clearly moved itself to the opposite side. All things hence appeared to point in the direction of this, that I was gradually failing to hold the procession of my original and better side, and becoming gradually united with my second and evil one. Between those two characters, I now thought that I had to decide my preference. My two characters had a common memory, but all other abilities were mainly unequally distributed between them. Dr. Jekyll, who was compound, now with the most sensitive concerns, now with a greedy enthusiasm, performed and shared in the delights and exciting experiences of Hyde's. Yet Hyde was unconcerned with Jekyll, or but stored him in his memory as the mountain bandit remembers the cave in which he hides himself from quest. Jekyll was interested in Hyde more than a standard father, and again Hyde was more indifferent than a standard son. To kill Jekyll was to be deprived of appetites which I had secretly desired for a long time and had recently begun to have. To kill Hyde was to stop a great number of interests and goals, and to become forever hated and lonely. It may now seem uneven. In spite of that, there was still an additional thoughtfulness in the balances. While Jekyll would suffer painfully in the fires of self-control, Hyde could not even be aware of what he had lost. Strange as my changing conditions were, the structure of this argument is as old and ordinary as man. Much the same incentives and concerns cast the die for any seduced and trembling sinner, and it quarreled with me, as it falls with so vast a majority of my fellows, that I preferred my good side and saw that I was in a wish of keeping it in the strength. Yes, finally I chose old and unhappy Henry Jekyll, encircled by friends and honest hopes, and said a firm goodbye to unlimited freedom, the relatively young and a dynamic body, with all of its exclusive delights that I had enjoyed in the costume of Edward Hyde. I made this preference maybe with some instinctive reservation, as I neither sold the house in Soho, in which my other self, Mr. Hyde, stayed, nor got rid of the clothes of Hyde's, which are still available to be used in my cabinet. So I don't know how serious I was when taking this killing Hyde decision. As I said, it was maybe an instinctive reservation. For 2 months, however, I went on my decisiveness. In that period, I lived in a life of such seriousness as I had never before reached, and enjoyed correcting my faults with a relieved conscience. But time started finally to destroy the strength of my concern. I missed what I did in the disguise of Edward Hyde, without ruining my reputation, which took a long time to get. After an unlimited freedom, it was like torture to have a life which lacked the pleasures and secret desires. At last, a time in which I lacked of some ethical strength, it led me to mix and drink the transformation chemical once more. I had thought much before drinking that drug, yet it was a strange feeling for me to keep up with Hyde's desires, while leading a very silent and dull life. Now it was time to release the creature, as my devil had been long caged. He exited roaring. I was aware of what I was doing, even when I drank that chemical. It was releasing an uncontrolled power for an unlimited freedom. It must have been this, I believe, that moved in my soul that storm of impatience, further with which I obeyed the civilities of my sad victim. I now say, however, before God, no person who is ethically reasonable could have been said to be guilty of that crime on so compassion-arousing a provocation. As a result, I had, by free will, taken away myself from all those balancing natural senses by which even the most down-going man goes on to walk with a certain degree of decisiveness among temptations that always try to change his way to a worse direction with the attraction of some pleasures. And in my situation, to be tempted, in fact, without a doubt, was to be victimized. Immediately, the soul of hell woke up in me and was moving aggressively. With a transport of gaiety, I behaved crudely to the body that exhibits no sign of resist. Enjoying the pleasures that I couldn't get as of Jekyll, every moment, and no sooner the exhaustion had started to come after all, when I was abruptly, in the top fit of my amusement, hit through my heart by a cold feeling of horror. The reality showed up. I saw my life to be penalty, and escaped from the scene of these surpluses. Suddenly, my enthusiasm of evil satisfied and aroused. My love of life was now on its highest peak. I rushed to the house where Hyde stayed, and, to make the matter doubly sure, demolished my papers. From that place I went out by way of the bright streets, in the same divided mental storm, being proud on my crime, light-headedly planning others in the future, and yet still hurrying and still paying attention in my way for the steps of the avenger. Hyde had been singing a song joyfully as he mixed the chemical again, and while he drank it, pledged the killed man. The sharp pain of transformation had not done tearing him up, before Dr. Jekyll, with tearing eyes of gratefulness and regret, had dropped on his knees and raised his praying hands to God. The veil of gratified desires was torn entirely. I reviewed my life, thinking it entirely. I started from the days in which I was a child, when I started to learn, even walking, and by way of the self-denying work of my professional life, to reach over and over, with the same concept of fantasy, at the damned terrors of the evening. It was almost inevitable for me to scream aloud. I attempted with tears, praying to overwhelm the crowd of terrible figures and sounds with which my memory swarmed against poor Henry Jekyll. And however, between the praise, the ugly face of my evil side looked at with a steady gaze into my spirit. As the sharpness of this regret began to disappear, it was achieved by a feeling of rejoice. The problem due to my behavior now had its solution. Hyde was from that time onward impossible to exist again. Whether I would or not, I was now restricted to my non-evil part of my character. And oh, how happy I was to think of that! With what willing modesty I hugged once more the limitations of my ordinary life. With what frank act of reuniting the door which served my goings and comings now had been closed and locked. Moreover, I got rid of the key. The following day, the news that the murder had been solved was heard. Hyde's guilt was obvious, a fact which everyone now would know. Also, it had been found out that the victim was a man respected in public opinion. It was not only an illegal act, it had been also a disastrous stupidity. It seems I was happy to learn it. In my opinion, I was pleased to have my better impulses, thus supported and preserved by the fears of the scaffold. Jekyll was now a refugee city for me. I decided in my future behaviors to pay off the past, and I can frankly say that my firm decision was fertile of some good. One knows himself or herself very earnestly. In last year's last a few months, I achieved relieving my suffering with difficulty. You're already aware that much was done for others, and that the time passed peacefully, closely, joyfully for me. I can't really say that I got bored of this good and harmless life. In my opinion, instead, that I day by day got pleasure of it more entirely. But I was still damned with my dualism of intention. And as the first edge of my regret disappeared, the weaker side of me, for a long time took unrestrained pleasure in, so lately imprisoned, began to speak loudly for permission. I didn't dream of reviving Hyde. The thought of that would alarm me. No, I was again attracted to enjoy the life with my conscience in my own person, and it was as a simple secret guilt that I finally fell before the attacks of a temptation. All things have their ends. The most spacious step has been taken eventually, and this brief unbalanced behavior to my evil side at last destroyed the balance of my psychology. Anyway, I was not scared. The fall appeared to be quite natural, as if it was a return to the old days before I had discovered that chemical. It was a very good January day with an open sky, as snow had melted the ground and it was very wet. But there were no clouds, and the park which had taken the name of Regent's was exhibiting all the signs of a beautiful winter day. So I sat under the sunshine, on a bench. The creature inside me was thinking about the past pleasures that were buried in the innermost place of memory. The better side a little sleepy, promising following regret. However, not yet took action to begin. After everything else, I thought, I had nearly the same characteristics that my neighbors also had. After thinking that, I smiled, considering myself similar to other men, considering my active goodwill with the idle brutality of their disregard. And at the precise time of that arrogant thought, my regret joined me, a horrible disgust, and the most deadly shuddering. These disappeared, and left me weak, and after that, as in its turn weakness declined, I began to be conscious of an alteration in the nature of my thoughts, a bigger courage, a disrespect of risk, an answer to the bonds of responsibility. Looking down, I realized that my clothes hung shapelessly on my smaller limbs. The hand on my knee was covered with hair. I had become Edward Hyde one more time. Short time before, I was in a pretty good situation, including no risk, having all men's admiration, rich, beloved the cloth awaiting for me at home. And now I was in the worst situation, wanted by the police, houseless, a known guilty, to be killed due to my illegal actions. My reason almost stopped thinking, yet it did not disappoint me entirely. I have seen not just one time that in my second nature my senses seemed, was made pointed and my mood was more tensely flexible. So it occurred that, where Jekyll possibly might have given in, Hyde came back to the significance of that moment. My chemicals had to be in some place inside my cabinet. How could it be possible to get them? It was a difficult problem for me, yet I should solve it, by myself. I had closed the laboratory door before. It was also impossible for me to seek to enter by the house, as my servants would send me to execution. Then I understood that I had to find someone to do this job for me, and suddenly Dr. Lanyon came to my mind. Yet how could I reach him? I asked myself. Assuming that I did reach him, how could I persuade Lanyon to do this? And how should I, a stranger and annoying visitor, persuade the famous physician to steal the study of his fellow worker, Dr. Jekyll? Afterwards, I recalled that from my original identity, I still had one more inheritance. I still could write with my own handwriting, Jekyll's handwriting, and at the moment that I found out the idea of that key point, the way that I must go after turned into lighted up in every point. As a result of that, having arranged my clothes as well as I could, I drove to a hotel in Portland Street. Somehow I was able to remember that name. At my appearance, which was funny enough, no matter how tragic a fate, these pieces of clothing covered it. The driver couldn't stop smiling, looking at me. I gave him a look, which was evil enough and full of devilish fury, as supposed, the smile on his face soon turned into a reserved fear. How lucky he was! However, I was luckier, as I could easily beat him right there and get into trouble. Edward Hyde was an uncontrollable man who sometimes acted insanely. At last I arrived at the hotel, found a private room, and I requested paper and pen to write. Hyde, in the risk of death, was a creature new to me, shaken with excessive anger, drowned in the murder, desiring to cause suffering. Despite all of the incapability and all the faulty behaviors, Edward Hyde was not a fool. On the contrary, he was very clever. First, he controlled his fury with a great difficulty, and started to write his two important letters. One to Lanyon, and the other was to be sent to Poole. And after finishing composing, he sent the letters. After that time, he waited all day, sitting over the fire in his private room, with a great anxiety. There he ate dinner. With his fears, he was alone. The waiter could easily be observed to fear after seeing him, and afterwards, when it was fully night, he went out of the hotel, to the corner of a taxi, and was driven back and forth around the sides of the city. That evil man can't be named human. Only fear and hatred could live in him. He guessed that the driver had begun to suspect. He got off the taxi and took the risk to walk on foot. It was really dangerous for him to walk, as he now was a well-known murderer. Everyone would be proud of telling this to the police. Maybe it was better to get rid of the suspicion of the driver than attracting some possible suspicion from the other people at that hour. He was already very tired in his too large clothes, and in that frustration a woman spoke to him, requesting him to buy a box of lights. He punched her face, and she escaped while weeping. When I regained my consciousness at LANYON'S, I noticed the horror of my old friend, which affected me quite a lot. It was a very depressing thing for Lanyon to see that. I was so sorry about it. It even affected my dreams. I was walking back and forth without an aim, across the court after I had breakfast, in the cold air with pleasure. Suddenly, this unbearable pain and strange sensation of transformation captured me. I had to go to the shelter of my cabinet before that arrival took control and started to perform his inhuman behaviors. This time, a double dose was what made me regain the control of my body as Jekyll. Oh my God! After nearly 6 hours, while I was sitting and looking sadly in the fire, the sharp pains returned, and the chemical had to be re-implemented. After a short time, it appeared only by a great effort, as of exercise, and only under the prompt stimulation of the mixture, that I was able to get the Jekyll's appearance back. 24 hours a day, I had to be very cautious and alert, beyond everything else. If I slept, or even napped for a moment in my chair, I always woke up as Edward Hyde. Under the tension of this continually approaching, terrible fate, I became a creature in my own body, consumed to death. I was now weak both in body and mind, and only busy with one thought, the fear of my other self. But when I slept, or when the benefits of the medicine disappeared, my appearance would change almost without transition. Also, the pains of transition decreased day by day. The powers of Hyde appeared to have developed with Dr. Jekyll's deprivation of health, and certainly the both character of mine hated each other. For Jekyll, Hyde was a thing of vital instinct. That creature was harmful for him, and at last they would share the same destiny of death. The hatred of Hyde for Jekyll was absolutely different than Jekyll's. His fear of death compelled him continually to hide himself in Jekyll's disguise and return to his inferior station of a piece instead of a person. But he hated that requirement. He hated the depression into which Jekyll was now fallen. And thus he showed his hatred by destroying some of the pages of my books, burning the letters and destroying the portrait even of my father. And actually, as he knew his life was strictly related to my life, he didn't attempt to kill me. It has no value, and the time makes me terribly unsuccessful to tell more. No person has ever suffered such dreadful pain, and they brought me nothing but a certain hardness of soul, a certain giving in of hopelessness, and my penalty might have continued for quite a long time, but for the last catastrophe which has now occurred, and which has at last separated me from my own face and character. My salt supply, the amount of which I hadn't increased by reserving some more since the date of the first experiment, began to run out. Anyway, with a fresh supply, I mixed the chemical, followed it by boiling, and the first change of color, however not the second. I consumed it and it was somehow useless. Poole will tell you how I have looked for that chemical in the whole of London. It was in vain, and I am now convinced that my first salt was impure, and that it was the impurity which made the mixture efficient. After a week, I am now finishing my letter with the effect of the drug mixed with the last old powders. Therefore, this is the last of a few moments of mine. I must give an end to my letter as soon as possible, for Hyde will destroy it if he sees it. After some time, when I will again and forever revive that hated personality, I know how I will be an evil creature, or continue, with a great fear, to walk back and forth in this room and give ear to every sound of danger. Will Hyde be executed? Or will he find bravery to release himself at the last moment? I have no idea. I am indifferent. This is my real hour of death, and the rest is not about me but Hyde. So here, as I drop the pen and seal up the envelope which has my confession, I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end.